Good afternoon, everybody. We have Mr. Rajeev Mehrotra with us today, who will be talking to us on the topic, the Buddhist Science of Mind Training. As was given in the introduction, I am a clinical psychologist, so a lot of work that I do, even with my clients in therapy, involves some of the principles that I think overlap with the school of thought that Buddhism is, and we will be talking more in detail about the learnings and principles that talk about Buddhist science of mind training. So just to be able to use that and hopefully take some messages and key takeaways from our discussion today for you all to apply and practically see how this knowledge can be implemented in life to also bring about positive changes for our mental health and overall well-being. So yeah, without further ado, I think I'll start with just having you, sir, maybe tell us in your own words and in your own experience, since you've been learning this, learning Buddhism since so many years now under His Holiness the Dalai Lama. In your own words and experience, what would you say the Buddhist science of mind training is? How would you describe it? What principles surround it for the audience?
Well, first let me say that how very delighted I am to be here. I'm a great fan of the organizer, Aparna, and her team. And so it's a very special privilege to be sitting here. And we've had a wonderful conversation before we came in here, and with this incredible clinical psychologist. And first thing that sort of comes to mind is how an empty stomach at lunchtime influences one's emotions. And so I shall be drawing on that state of mind as I speak.
Let's talk about the here and now. What's coming up for you, sir?
So what really happens is that when you have an empty stomach is that the awareness and consciousness tends to travel downwards instead of the flow of energy, which in our traditions moves from the lower chakra up to the brain. So, but usually determination and willpower can compensate for that, and present company and this context is a suitable distraction. So I hope to be able to overcome that. Well, this is sort of few random thoughts, and some of them I will try to give some structure to, and please feel free to interrupt if I'm rambling or make no sense, which often does happen. I think the first aspect is that, what is the mind? And, what are feelings and emotions? And when is that a problem? And I think that there has been debate for millennia as to what the mind is and what the consciousness is. So for our purposes, we will really just sort of stay with the simple idea that our awareness of our thoughts and the thoughts themselves and the activity of the thought is what forms the mind. Because if you look for the mind, you will not find it anywhere. And so you'd have to use the Indian tradition of neti neti, it's not this, it's not this, it's not that. So very often when we talk about mental health and a healthy mind, it is in some senses an oxymoron. And so the starting point of Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist training of the mind is that if the mind does not independently exist, then we needn't worry or panic about what is happening with the mind itself. So it's not like a diseased organ or something that you treat because it's empirical. And identical thoughts in two different people, one might find it invigorating and empowering, and the other might find it overwhelming. And equally, the reflection of traditional approaches to to stress or external parameters. So you have people who came out of the decimation of the Jews in Germany, in Auschwitz. But some people came out badly scarred, and others came out empowered and full of compassion for what was going on. So we are a little nervous about a purely circumstantial or verbalized articulation of conditions of the mind. Because ultimately the experience of pain and discomfort is extremely singular and unique, and even more difficult to communicate. I mean, forget how we communicate our state of mind or our feelings or what have you, when I can't even tell you what this glass of water tastes like unless you have tasted it. So the Buddhist approach of training the mind is non-specific in that sense. It tends to be generic for all states of mind and being. And that really is the aspiration of the technique and the philosophy. So you don't really go and say, I have depression, and this is the form of my depression, and this is the aggravator, so can I dissect it and find a solution to it? And so we believe that the mind is merely a designation, and when we struggle with our thoughts, we need to use techniques that have resonances in modern practice that will remind us that the thought is just a thought, and it is not necessarily a reflection of reality. So if I suffer and the pain I feel, I have no idea how to describe what that pain is. So we begin to look at physical correlatives to feelings. And this is really, I'm referring not to the Buddhist practice from the tradition that I come from, but just to give you a sense of the philosophical and civilizational value of the idea of looking at physical sensations as correlatives of emotional states. And I think the best example of that is really yoga. And so what yoga is really doing is that it is helping to take your consciousness or your awareness to physical sensations and to different parts of the body and bring them to awareness. And so yoga has now been reduced to being a sort of, purely a physical good health that gets your blood pressure in order, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just shared an experience. I had the privilege of being a student of B.K. Iyengar, one of the great iconic yoga teachers. And I knew him for about 40 years. And towards the end of his life, into his late 90s, I went to see him when it looked like he was fading. And he was in a very complex yoga posture that he held for hours. And I said, Guruji, what are you doing? And he said, because I feel that before I leave my body, there are still parts of my body where my consciousness has not reached. And so at the mundane level, we are aware of the relationship between mind and body, or a hungry stomach and what I might say, but it goes far, far deeper than that. So one of the ways of accessing our emotional states and finding core relatives that we can touch or experience more concretely is through the body. And so one of the practices is, again, I had a wonderful conversation with her before, is that, when we find that there are uncomfortable emotions coming up, we train ourselves to experience the physical sensations that go with it and just be with experiencing them without comment and without resistance. Because a sensation is a sensation. Our label for that is that it is uncomfortable because we have trained ourselves to reject the uncomfortable. And so the philosophical framework that comes from Buddhism is really to suggest that we suffer because we do not embrace the true nature of reality. And the true nature of reality is, there are three pillars to that, and one is that things are impermanent, they change, that we are interdependent, and that everything exists on the basis of causality. And why is that important? Because if we have truly internalized that everything is impermanent, it means that we do not experience the suffering of change. So much of our suffering comes about because of our inability or reluctance to embrace change. So someone we love dies, a relationship fades, a job we want we don't get, a young child that you've given birth to dies, and but that is the true nature of reality. So we don't get into the individual dialectic or conversation of your particular experience of the predicament, but say, let us just address as an antidote these three principles. And if we have truly internalized it, then we will recognize that this and accept, and not as resignation, but as embracing that this is the human condition. There's nothing that we can do about it. It is normal and it is natural. And our thoughts that come up are only thoughts. And so, so the practice of mind training is born of this assumption. And of course, it starts as with nurturing concentration. So we argue that, we suggest that just as we invest so much of our time in our careers, in making ourselves attractive, in our professions, in learning a skill, whether it is music or playing golf, that we have stopped investing our time in training ourselves to heal or to nurture the mind. So the first urging is that you need to invest beyond the teachings of philosophy, which is the wisdom aspect, is to train oneself in the method. And this is a very important aspect, not just about Buddhism, but of our entire civilizational heritage. That for us, all knowledge and every teaching has the component of method and wisdom. And the wisdom is the verbalized knowledge, and the method leads to the reflective, non-conceptual experience. And just to give you an example, is, for example, I could be driving a car. And physically I'm driving a car, but I'm driving the car reflexively while I could be thinking of something else. So when we talk about the mind and consciousness, we're really talking about levels of very subtle aspects of mind or awareness and agency. So we believe that the great challenge in healing the mind through other routes is the aspect of agency, which means that I know I must not be angry, and that anger is counterintuitive. I know that certain action XYZ will lead to stress and anxiety, and yet I am unable to find the agency to hold back.
So in a sense, are we talking about both acceptance and awareness? Because I heard you say in the middle somewhere where you talked about an observation where I'm accepting that these are just thoughts, or I'm accepting that these are just body sensations, but this is different from resignation. So I'm not detached, or I'm not laid back in a sense with them. But knowing and accepting that these are the things that I'm observing and these are labeled such. Are you talking about just that awareness is what the mind training practice is about and what Buddhism teaches us?
Well, there's no neither resignation nor acceptance, because if we circumscribe that with resignation or acceptance, then we have already set a goal for it. So it is pure awareness, and we suggest that when you become aware of the true nature of reality, then it's dissolves on its own. So neither acceptance nor resignation is an aspiration. Because if I said, accept the fact that someone you love is going to die, you may accept it, but unless you have realized it, so we talk about realization. Again, the problem with all discourse, and which is why the method is so important, is that this is a conceptual vocabulary. And I mean, we can quibble about words, but the method is what it is. I'm just going to delve a little bit on the method, because I think this was just by way of background,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
it is the method that is really important. And what we normally urge is that you work on both the method and the wisdom so that it impacts your deepest reflexive responses, like driving the car and thinking something else. So you're just driving because that has now become instinctive for you. So how do we convert insight into that? And so we have narrowed it down to, as I mentioned, impermanence, interdependence, and what we call shunya, but that is the true nature of reality on causality. So, the practice in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition really begins with nurturing concentration and simultaneous to other states of mind. And concentration comes from, ideally, in most schools, with the breath. So that serves two purposes, because when you're concentrating on the breath, the mind can be trained. And today I met a gentleman who was talking about I was discussing the neuroplasticity of the brain. So we know that particular thoughts can change the biochemistry of the brain. And so when you start with concentration, you can change the biochemistry of the brain. That facilitates concentration, just as if I wanted to strengthen my left arm or lose 5 kilos from my waistline, that I could practice and engage in that, and that would happen. And so mental concentration enables that to happen. And in yoga and in different traditions, you concentrate sometimes on a candle, you can concentrate on a mantra, but it all evolves around concentration. So in our tradition, we tend to, I don't want to go into deity and the role of the deity. It's very complex, but let's just stay with the breath. So you concentrate on the breath, and there are many prescriptions how you concentrate on the breath. So in pure mindfulness, you just concentrate on the breath without intervention. You concentrate on the breath by regulating it, what have you. I don't want to go into the details of that. So what that concentrating on the breath does, it trains the mind to concentrate and also connects you with the relationship between your breath and the mind state. And you begin to become aware of that. And we don't give it a destination, because we feel that the minute you have verbalized the destination, then that becomes a substitute for the experience itself rather than the description of the state of mind. And so we're also reluctant, so a teacher will be very reluctant to suggest to you that your practice is going well or going badly, or you're accepting or you're not. It just is. Because the minute I say to you that that's a good meditation, your evolution and growth has stopped, because you're seeking to replicate what has been given the stamp of approval. So the enormous emphasis on method, and just the method, and we leave it at that. And then what we say is that this is a technique that has survived 2,500 years of practice, and we have seen the outcomes of that. in a broad sense. So we would start with the breath, and as the mind begins to calm down, we start looking at how we can implant thought, through thought, make imprints on our consciousness that stimulate or come together for our responses. So just like in Western psychiatry, we're saying that childhood experiences leave imprints in our consciousness, which then impact how we view the world and subsequent behavior. So we believe that the cultivation of these three elements, and there's a fourth one, compassion, antidotes whatever those imprints might be that are stirring up things in our consciousness.
Right. As I hear you, I understand how this is one of the practices with which you can learn to train the mind using the Buddhist principles that you've been talking about. Um, but my question here would be that, say, we start the practice of learning how to concentrate and gradually, with guidance, imbibe truly what that looks like. Um, how does it translate into normal and daily life?
No,
So,
no, first, let me give you an example of how we would seek to implant this, because it is in the techniques that the richness of it. So we're not merely saying that cultivate compassion or you must recognize the true nature of reality. We're going to tell you how to recognize the true nature of reality. So a very abbreviated, so if you, we can't do this, it'll take a lot of time, but if you were to sort of quieten your mind and you were to reflect, plant the seeds of the recognition that if I am sitting here and speaking to you, let's look at interdependence, speaking to you, the number of factors that have made it possible for me to be here is that, I know Aparna, she sends me an invitation, I sit in a car, the car has been manufactured by somebody, and this metal has come from somewhere else. It is an infinite range of interconnectednesses that make it possible for me to be here. Now, the more I reflect on this, the more the seed and the idea and the many permutation and combinations that we can illustrate interdependence, we go through them serially in a state of concentration so that this idea gets embedded in our minds. And the same thing happens with impermanence. I see the gentleman looking at a phone. If it's a new phone, and we're very excited about it, and then it gets the first nick, and then it begins to fade away. It's the same phone, or a new car, or the things that we aspire to, or people we've loved who have passed away. So we then recognize that inherent in the human condition is impermanence. And then if you recognize impermanence and you recognize interdependence and you reflect on that, you see the extremely powerful role of compassion. And why do you see that? Because the fact that I'm sitting here depends on the compassion of my parents, that the sperm and the egg fertilized. And then when I was born, all the inputs that happened for everything that I eat and I drink, and teachers who educated me, etc., etc., etc. So I recognize that I am a product of acts of compassion, or every human being is in some measure. Now, then we begin to further, as you delve further into the idea of compassion through reflection, and in a sense, what is meditation? You know, I think that increasingly meditation is seen as an anesthetic, that you dull your mind or distract your mind from pain. But meditation is familiarizing your mind with the true nature of reality. And now we know from, you probably know from as a clinical psychologist, that huge amounts of research have been done to demonstrate that people who come with mental problems are obsessed with their I, me, I have this problem, I have this problem. Hell with the rest of the world. So, at the very least, the practice of compassion softens the sense of the self that suffers, because it is our sense of the self that aggravates suffering. So, which is why very often, say, a loving mother whose deep compassion for her children uh, gives her that space to be able to process and accommodate what children often do to their parents, or in any context or relationship. So then cultivating of compassion, for example, the technique that we use in reflecting on compassion, one starts with the interdependence idea that, look, my life is dependent, has been dependent, and so many people have been at cause in it. But another very a common practice is that we visualize our mothers. And not just visualize, but we feel their warmth, their fragrance, and then while we hold that feeling of the mother, we replace the mother with someone towards whom we feel neutral, and then with the enemy. And see if we can hold that experience, including physical sensation and the state of the mind. And so one of the things that I found most powerful and moving when I first went to Dharamsala was that here where there's been genocide in Tibet, and the Tibetan monks used to, their prayer mat said, pray for the Chinese. And they started every morning's prayer with, may the veils of delusion lift. And that has this connection with the true nature of reality, that they're acting the way they are because they're out of touch with the true nature of reality. And the point is that when we talk about the true nature of reality, this is not Buddhism. It is the true nature of reality. So, and the teaching or the practice that we're talking about derives from Buddhist ideas, but is not limited to the practice of Buddhism. It just so happened that the Buddha was struggling with his own predicament, and he went out in search for a response not to his suffering, but the suffering of the human condition. So the minute we begin to extrapolate from the sense of our suffering to that of the suffering of the human species, of the human condition. And interestingly, after he finished his time under the tree and had experienced a decisive, not knowledge, because we would say knowledge again is verbalized, is verbal, and we analyze ourselves verbally, the experience or insight, he didn't know what to do, because he felt this was a non-conceptual experience and he didn't know how to communicate it. And so he was silent for several weeks. So he said, what I can do is to teach the method. And so what I've shared with you is a sort of an abbreviated nutshell of a method which is accessible to us all without really being contradictory to our particular intellectual faith or other positions. So that sort of is really the key to this.
Right, absolutely. And with this method, like you're explaining, sir, if we
Don't
could
call me
use...
sir.
If, with this method, if we could use the last few minutes to sort of maybe help the audience with certain key takeaways that as layman, and like I was trying to ask earlier with, daily life experiences, what is something, where do we start? Where do we start with, learning about the method or trying to incorporate and practice it on a daily basis um, to reach a place where, after all these years, I think you've been able to imbibe all this wisdom and
No.
live it.
Let me not be. No, I haven't imbibed all this wisdom. And I should say, I would share two things with you. And again, in your role as a clinical psychologist and people who have come from different healing traditions, that ultimately what we're talking about is behavior change. Yeah, and so I was at His Holiness engages in regular conversations and dialogues with scientists and psychiatrists and people of other religions and traditions. And there's a lot of funding and money involved around it now. So I was attending one of they called Mind Life conferences. So I was attending this conference, and for 4 days, the Dalai Lama was silent. And people came up and they said they've done these studies, and the studies have shown that with the practice of mindfulness, of this practice, or practice X, Y, and Z, that there was measurable behavior change. And so at the end of 4 days, at his concluding remarks, he said, you know, I have been doing these practices since I was, 7, 8 years old. I'm 88 years now, old now. But, you know, behavior change is not easy. So I make no claims for behavior change. I mean, I would just say that things are a little shade better, and I have some sense of context. And so I can't speak from having achieved that wisdom, but I can only say that it's been about 40 years of practice, and that yes, my goodness, the disruptions of my life. I thought this was someone snooping on me to see that I'm on good behavior, you know, and saying the right things. These days, that's very important. So, you know, the process really is that you begin to feel and experience, because that is the sort of our process of observing ourselves. But certainly at the more subtle level, one is far less reactive to situations. And I have to hasten to add, both that are positive and that we would claim we seek, which someone says you're a great guy, or someone says you're talking a lot of rubbish. So reacting a little less to both of them, and perhaps getting a slightly better night's sleep. And the Sunday afternoon nap that I'm missing.
All right. Thank you so much, sir. I think, thank you so much. It has been,
You see, sir is very dangerous, because it gives one ego, or the risk of it. So then I have to be even more vigilant. This young lady is sort of saying wonderful things about me. Now, dare I believe them? So, be kind to me.
Absolutely. I think with how he's described the learnings and the principles of the Buddhist science and focused a lot on the method, something that I can draw from our conversation is definitely just the starting point has to be observation and getting more in touch with ourselves. And I think small practices can then build up, and of course using the guidance of teachers and people who are learned in how to practice the method. But the starting point, definitely for me, the takeaway that I am taking from our conversation today is maybe sitting more with myself and observing what my inner experiences look like, and slowly and gradually maybe that practice in itself is going to help me.
Dare I comment on that?
Absolutely.
Very dangerous. Because the minute you start with that, it reinforces your sense of self, which is what we're trying to diminish. So the practical thing to do is altruism, is compassion. So what we can do, and I don't think that, well, let me just finish. What we can do is what you're doing by being here, or Aparna is doing by organizing this event, and what you're doing professionally. And we were talking about niyat, the motivation. So we feel that the critical aspect in the choice we make is to observe our motivation. And is the motivation to gratify ourselves, or is the motivation to make a difference in someone else's life? Now, that doesn't mean that we all have to sort of dress in loincloths like Gandhi and live in the forests. It means, and this is Gandhi's famous quote, that there's enough for everybody's need, but not our greed. So can we use that yardstick in the choices that we make, and consciously try and work in an outer directed way for other people and experience the satisfaction that it gives us? And even without going through the formal structures of method, if we begin to observe how our lives are interdependent and how our lives confront so much impermanence. So, when it happens to us, which will happen every day in some measure, I mean, whether it is, the 10 years over which I lost my hair, there are so many smaller elements of impermanence. The first wrinkle in us or in those we love. So if we are constantly looking out for these, that becomes the first step. And then meditation is merely the formal practice of intensifying this process. And we have to find the time, and we are downright foolish if we don't find the time that at least equals the time we spend on ourselves and our appearance and our acquisitions, because ultimately it is the mind that experiences our acquisitions. It is our mind that experiences how people respond to how beautiful we look. And isn't it our vanity that when we go out having spent a lot of money on ourselves, that everybody's really worried about how I'm looking? Or will now begin to notice me not for who I am, but what I'm looking at. So it is this kind of discourse that helps create the predisposition to engage in the formal practice that intensifies it. So I'm sorry.
Thank you for clarifying that for me. I definitely have some of these words to reflect on and take away as thoughts that I will ponder on. And
to consider, and feel free to reject.
Absolutely, yeah. And stay in touch that way. All right. And on that note, I think we're also up with our time. I will thank you, sir, for your time and
I
the
loved
lovely
it.
messages that
Any
you've shared
questions,
with
I
us.
think, if there's time, otherwise I'm happy to go and have lunch. Okay, sure. I thought I was going to have lunch with this lady and she could ask all the questions she wanted, but anyway.
Yeah, so my question is, working in the mental health sector in low-income communities, there is this very strong aspect of work that you need to build self-image, self-esteem, self-confidence, self-care, self-love on the one side. But you know that there is also a lot of pain which is coming to being so close to the self. So what is the middle ground for practitioners to take in this journey?
Well, the self is experiencing pain because it has a heightened sense of self, and so beyond a point, as I said, that you can look at it semantically, and nor do we look at it with the certitude that our way is the highway. And so we tend to look at mental health actually I'm not happy with the word mental health. It's more like mental wellness or something else. Because health always reminds me of, can it be measured by either quizzes or thermometers or a brain scan, which I hope to get done in the next couple of days, as to what is the state of my mind. And so ultimately, there cannot be any one specific definitive way. It depends on the capacity of the individual, but most importantly, and this is something I didn't delve much on, is that ultimately it is all a function of motivation. So, for example, those of us who are familiar with the idea of karma, where we say that every action has a reaction and that we should accumulate positive karma. So, in our sense, positive karma is first that we shouldn't look at karma, but we should look at karmas. So it isn't that an individual act has an individual correlative. And what determines the action is the motivation. And the motivation is compassion. So, for example, and this is the big difference between what Gandhiji said, where the means are as important as the ends. But in our tradition, we don't believe that. We believe it is the motivation that is crucial. And I know this is a simplistic understanding of both Gandhiji and Buddhism. But so it means that if, a very commonplace example that could happen to anybody, that there is a riot against a certain community, and I harbor a member of that community in my home, and the thugs come out and say, "Are you harboring someone?" And I say, "No, I've told a lie." But that has been done with the right motivation, or a motivation of compassion. So the imprint of that in my consciousness will be positive. So what we can bring to situations which we are not able to conceptually and intellectually analyze, because I have argued for the limitations of that conceptual process, is our motivation. And so when we look at people who are struggling and suffering, the last thing you can do is to come with a predetermined prescription or a protocol, which is something that Western approaches to treating the mind have. So we need to come to it from our motivation, and motivation involves both head and heart. And so that will tailor an individual response that is in the best interest of the individual. So it doesn't mean that I'm intervening from a position of self. I have the answer. It's like when people are grieving, and we think we can go and say something or do something which is parroted and will make a difference. So it really is, there are some things to which there isn't a protocol answer other than a reflection on our motivation. So, just to share again my experience with the Dalai Lama when we are talking about the foundation, he's our chairperson. And so when I ask him, do you think we should do this? His response is very simple. Are you convinced it's useful? That's it. There's no need for any other. We can discuss how useful it is. And then that's it. That's the only yardstick. So that's the call that you have to take. And there is no formula. And there is no verbalized framing that can get you inside the experience of someone's pain, other than empathy. I hope that makes some sense.
Thank you so much, sir.
Wow.
I know you're hungry. I'm really
No,
sorry.
no. I'm suitably distracted. And I could do with losing some weight, so it's not a problem.
All right. My question is very simple. I wanted to ask you about how do we build a sense of detachment in this materialistic world? Because with social media and with whatever we are seeing around us, the attachment to it has been increasing over the number of years. So when it comes to our loved ones, our dogs, our clothes, our possessions, etc., how do you suggest do we detach ourselves? And what's the boundary?
No magic formula, hard work. That's the first. But I'll tell you, this is really what I've been saying, that if we start reflecting on impermanence, and not just as a response, oh, I see my friend there from Mansikang at the back. Hello. So the minute we see that the things that we are attached to are impermanent and are going to fade and are going to dissolve, and we recognize it and internalize it, it's the natural logic and reflex of the mind that our attachment to it will diminish. When we recognize that it's, and sometimes if we feel hostile to someone and we see someone as the enemy, we recognize our interdependence. And I think nothing has reinforced the idea of interdependence as climate change. and not climate change as we used to talk about, it's going to something that's going to happen 50 years from now. It's here and now. And also modern science, which tells you from chaos theory and quantum theory that a butterfly flapping its wings, and this, there's an old example in the rainforests of the Amazon, can create a storm in Bangladesh. So this is not just, ancient knowledge. Today, all the things that we're talking to you about are rational, logical, and scientific. There's no God or the Buddha's wisdom involved here. So if we are foolish enough to be attached to something that's impermanent, I'm sorry, we deserve to suffer. And we have the option not to. And we don't exercise the option. Hence I shared this, the opening remark, that the thing that we are always taught, and when I meet the Dalai Lama, and sometimes if I'm standing in a crowd and he passes by me, he'll just whisper into my ear, practice, practice, practice. But without practice, and we have a method that has been product tested for 2,500 years. It doesn't depend on your faith. Now, if you can practice how beautiful you look, and it would be politically incorrect for me to talk about how beautiful you look in this context, but if we can have all these aspirations for ourselves, we don't have time to train our minds. Then we deserve to be miserable.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, on that note, I think we'll end our session for today. Thank you so much for your time.
Can I do one last question?
Oh, I thought I saw this great relief on everybody's face that the session was over, but okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So when you talk about usefulness, who is it useful for? Is it to yourself, or maybe to your workplace where you have to implement some policies, or to the person who's going to be impacted by your decisions? And because you said the key benchmark is to test whether it's useful or not, but you didn't specify whom is it useful for.
The notion of altruism is any action that goes beyond your self-interest. Now, if you're Mr. Modi, your idea of altruism would have to manifest itself in a very different manner than if you were a worker working in a mechanized environment where you had to do something monotonously. So it depends on the position, the context, and the action that you are able to reach out to. Obviously, if something is useful to you to enable you to be more compassionate and more effective, so if you're a doctor and you want to do an additional degree and train yourself to be a better doctor, that's wonderful, because the motivation, ultimate motivation, is to be a better doctor, to help people. But if your motivation is to have further degrees so you can buy a newer car as a doctor and send more people for medical tests, because now you are an MD as opposed to an MBBS, then obviously it's counterintuitive. So, I mean, personally, I don't see any real contradiction so long as the larger aspiration is outer directed. In some cases, it will be on a huge scale, and others it will be a macro one. I have no idea if that makes sense.
No,
Maybe
for example,
it's my stomach.
Just one last point on this. For example, in a capitalistic society, corporates, for example, they're saying, okay, I'm going to get rid of 10,000 employees because the company is not making profits, and if you don't make profits, you won't grow. And then you can say, if you grow, then you will hire them back, or hire more people, or be more productive. No, there's a clear contradiction here.
No, there isn't. I don't see a contradiction at all. Because you see, the point is that sometimes we have to do unpleasant things and be willing. Okay, let me just take one step backward and give you not backward, sideways. In Buddhism, we have the idea of a bodhisattva. And so we all take this vow. I completely failed to implement it, but this is something that, say, the Dalai Lama embodies. And the Bodhisattva vow is that in our tradition, the highest aspiration is to attain moksha, that we break out of the cycle of birth and rebirth and merge with Brahman. The Tibetan Buddhist Mahayana aspiration is that I will seek nirvana. What is the difference? The difference is that I will choose to take rebirth in the human condition in order to teach and serve humanity and experience the suffering of the human condition. So ultimately, the true bodhisattva will say, I am willing to take on the negative karma, such as telling a lie, in order to serve the larger good. So long as your intention and your motivation is in fact the larger good, and there is no harm in making money and profit, so long as that money and profit is directed for the larger good. And that is why we have this tradition in many faiths, including ours, in Buddhism and in Hinduism, that, 10% of all your income. I think the Sikhs have a similar benchmark, that I'm going to put 10% of my earnings into the public good. So some of these, sort of across faiths, these principles manifest according to different socio-cultural contexts at different points in history. The principle is the same. Someone may say 10%, someone may say 15, whatever it may be. So I was sharing with this wonderful young lady, and I mentioned this, that the Hindi word is far more appropriate than intention or motivation. इसमें आपकी नियत क्या है? बस, अगर आपकी नियत अच्छी है, तो आप गलती भी कर सकते हैं, which और लोग कहेंगे नहीं साहब इन्होंने ये नहीं करना चाहिए था मोदी साहब को. तो आप उनको जज करिए उनकी नियत क्या थी, बस.
Thank you.
And this is not to reference politics, I hasten to add.
All right, I'll just allow the host to give the closing note. Thank you so much for your time. And I think I've had quite a few hours of conversing with you, and that has given me a lot of wonderful reflections to take away. So thank you so much. The universe conspired for us to meet this way, and I'm glad for the opportunity.